How come I've never been introduced to a tamale before I got to LA? Wow, you're not my real friends.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily podcast on fantasy basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and I am the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_bball. We've got a surprisingly busy Wednesday coming up in the NBA with 4 games on for us to preview, so
let's get to it.
We will indeed get to it. We'll start with those 4 games. A couple of closeout opportunities for the Jazz, for the Rockets, and then you got the Cavs, Pacers, and Wizards, Raptors, both going to Game 5, tied 2-2. We will start by looking at one of those 2-2 series, and that is the Pacers and the Cleveland Cavaliers. If we look at how that they are matched up last time, the Cavs got a victory. 104-100. It was a pretty close game. That the Pacers had many opportunities to win this game and stormed home. In terms of rotational stuff, we saw Tristan Thompson make an appearance early on in the game. Kevin Love struggled once more. We still saw that same starting lineup for the Cavs with Kyle Korver and J.R. Smith starting and Kevin Love starting at center, but there was no George Hill, so Jose Calderon got the start. He only played 19 minutes, Jordan Clarkson getting some of those backup minutes, and then LeBron running the point at times. Very little to say about the rotation. Minimal Larry Nance minutes. Jeff Green, for whatever reason, was closing the game. And yeah, very similar stuff to how they ran things in Game 3 as well. For the Pacers, limited Miles Turner minutes in this one. He did get into some foul trouble, and Domantas Sabonis did play very, very well in this game. That hadn't been the pattern in the first 3 games, so that is something for us to pay attention to. But otherwise, more minimization of Trevor Booker, fewer minutes for Corey Joseph, and Lance Stevenson seeing his minutes bump up a little bit as he plays a little bit of extra defense on LeBron. Thad Young was also really strong in this game, and Collison and Victor Oladipo continue to play well despite both of those guys shooting poorly in this encounter. If we have a look at how it's going to, or how we think it potentially is going to play out in Game 5, the Cavs are favored by 6.5, and the total is 205. That's the lowest total of the day. It's also the second closest spread in terms of how Vegas is anticipating the closeness of these matchups, so that is something to pay attention to. For the point guards in this one, actually let's talk injuries. Georgie Hill is questionable. He's been dealing with injuries over the last 2-3 years, just consistently injured. Got a back problem at the moment. If he plays, he's not probably going to play 30 minutes, so I would expect him to be a mid-20s sort of a guy, and if he is out, Jose Calderon gets those minutes. If we look at Hill, though, at 3,600, if he is ruled ready to go, he wouldn't be a horrendous tournament play. He wouldn't be the best one, but he wouldn't be a horrible one at just $100 over the minimum. Corey Joseph has no value, or Daz Collison at 5,900. I actually like that for Dazza. I think that probably his upside is not all that high, but he is a fairly strong cash play. For the shooting guards, you got the plumber J.R. Smith, you got Kyle Korver. For Smith, you pay $700 fewer than what you do for Korver. Now, I don't see using either of those guys in cash, but if I can get JR into a tournament at $700 cheaper with probably as high, if not higher, upside than Korver, that would be the direction I would go in. Jordan Clarkson and Rodney Hood, 2 other shooting guards for Cleveland. I don't really like either of those guys there. I would consider Clarko a GPP guy if George Hill sits. Of course, the big named shooting guard in this one is Victor Oladipo. He is at $9,200. His shooting hasn't been great over the last couple, and he's only averaging 36 points over the last 3 games. So that's not quite at that $9,200 price point. I'd still be happy going back to him, but you do have, of course, a little bit more flexibility with 4 games on, that you don't necessarily have to use guy that you really guys that you really don't like as much in this sort of a setting. So Oladipo is still fine to use, but maybe with the way that things have been going and the shot's been a little bit off, that there might be other guys at that sort of salary that you prefer. For the small forwards, I'd actually like Lance Stevenson here at $3,800, mainly because of the increase in his role and that price point. I don't think he's going to be exploding for 30 or 35 or 40 points anytime soon, but I feel pretty good that he's going to get me at least 20, so I like him. And LeBron James. He's at 11,800. Just go ahead and write him in for cash and for tournaments. Really, really strong price. Yeah, it's come down $400. I'm totally on board with LeBron at that sort of a salary. Really hard to avoid using him, I think. Opposite him, Bojan Bogdanovic is at 5,300. He's inconsistent. We know that. It's a tournament play. It's not the strongest one, but it is still one. At power forward, we've got a couple of good options here. I think Domantas Sabonis at 4,000 is worth throwing into a tournament in case there's the turn of foul trouble. I wouldn't want to use it in cash. Kevin Love at 7,700. That salary has dropped quite a bit because he's only averaging 25 points over the last three. Has really reduced. I wouldn't be looking at him as a cash option either. More of a tournament guy. While Thaddeus Young's at 6,600 and has been really exceeding that number recently. I'm not sure that I'm ready to pencil or pen him in for cash, but I would consider it. Jeff Green, Larry Nance, Trevor Booker, I don't really see much with either of those guys. Although, I wouldn't be shocked if we get a random Jeff Green 9 at 3,700. That could be a tournament difference maker. He would be someone who I'd just put into my player pool because we know that he can have those random sort of games. We've seen it all the time. At center, Miles Turner's down to 5,800. It wasn't the greatest game for Miles, and he's only averaging 21 over the last three, but I still do think that he is worth looking at here as a cash center at that price, and the other guy there is Tristan Thompson, and I don't think we should be paying too much attention to him. On DraftKings, Kevin Love down to 6,700. Love that. That's a super strong price for Love. Oladipo, Thad Young at 5,500. That's a big difference from FanDuel, and I'd be in on Thad for cash. Oladipo as well. Miles Turner at 51. Now, LeBron is more highly priced on DraftKings than FanDuel. Still think that he's a worthwhile option, but he's not as really strong as what he looks over on FanDuel. And Daz Collison still also in a pretty strong position. The other stuff comes in fairly similar to how it looks on FanDuel. On Yahoo, Kyle Korver and Lance Stevenson, both at just $1 above minimum. I think both of those guys can be cash and tournament guys. And then there's a bunch of other tournament guys that I like. Love, Sabonis, Turner, and Smith. While LeBron at cash is a fairly good way to spend those big chunks of stud type money. He's a $58 player. But I feel good that he's going to get me 1.1, 1.2 times, which is pretty good value at the higher end price points. That'll do it for that game. Let's move on to the next one, which is another Eastern Conference matchup. It's the Washington Wizards going back to Toronto after taking care of business in their 2 games in Washington. The series is tied 2 games all. In terms of rotational stuff, still no Fred VanVleet for Toronto. He was out, and I'd be pretty stunned if he does play in Game 5. The Jedi, OG Anunoby.
Hello there.
He also suffered a sprained ankle in Game 4. He was able to return to the game, though. He's not going to be too much of a DFS impact. But if VanVleet and the Jedi are out, we're going to see a lot of Norm Powell and a lot of DeLon Wright. So they'll be guys to pay attention to, along with CJ Miles. So there is some opportunity here for some pretty interesting DFS type situations depending on how those injuries go. We saw a reduced Jonas Valanciunas, only 15 minutes, while Jakob Poeltl got the extra playing time there. Otherwise, the rotation was fairly steady. On the Washington side of things, very, very little to talk about much. And Gortat got his minutes bumped back up to 28 as Mike Scott went down to just 15 minutes. That's interesting. Ty Lawson playing over Thomas Satoransky. I just completely don't believe in it at all, but they won the game, so I'm not here to argue with that too much. Otherwise, everything else was pretty straightforward for the Wizards. Big games from Johnny Wall and Brad Beal. And Beal needed it after struggling through the first couple of games. So it's good to see him get that big game happening there in Game 4. If we move across now to how we think it's going to pan out in Game 5, the Raptors are favoured by 7, and the total is 216 points. So one of the highest totals of the day, and a decently narrow margin as well. So there's some interest there. Of course, we are checking on the status of Freddie VanVleet and the Jedi, who are both currently listed as questionable. For the point guards, VanVleet's down to 3,700. Even if he did play, I think he'll be fairly limited with that shoulder injury. So, of course, I wouldn't want to use him in cash in that spot. Maybe there's something in a tournament, but if he was fully fit and healthy at 3,700, it would be a no-brainer. I just don't think he's necessarily there. Kyle Lowry is at 8,300, and I've been loving Lowry throughout this series. He'd been consistently underpriced. I don't think he is now at 8,300. Sure, he can be used, but I wouldn't be looking at him as the number one guy. I'd much prefer to spend 10.7 on John Wall. Now, I know it's over almost $2,500 more to get John Wall in at that price, but he's just giving you 50, 55, 60 points almost every night, so I'm happy to do that. DeLon Wright at 4,800, I think becomes an absolutely steal of a cash guy if both Anunoby and Van Vliet are out. Even if just Freddie is out, I think that I think that DeLon can be an interesting option, but it gets a little bit more tenuous in that sort of a situation. Ty Lawson and Tomas Satoransky, I don't really see much for either of them. At shooting guard, DeRozan's up to 8,600, and he's producing pretty much most games. No worries with using him. I'd feel more comfortable using DeRozan than I would, say, Victor Oladipo at that shooting guard position on FanDuel. Feel a lot more comfortable in him at the cheaper price, achieving a similar level. Then you got Beal at 7,800, who did bounce back a little bit in Game 4, but still only posted 3,600. Not 3,600, that's a lot of points. 36 points, which is not quite enough at 7,800. So I'm not totally in on Beal. Always consider a tournament play, but I don't think that he's my cash lock type of a guy. I love Otto Porter, though, at 5,700. He looked better in Game 4, played a lot more minutes, had 29 points, and at 5,700, I feel really strongly about his floor and thinking it's going to be a good spot to use Otto here. CJ Miles at 3,500, he is an excellent tournament play, especially if we get Anunoby and Van Vliet out. He will have ample opportunity, and he's one of those guys who can have 2 points or he can have 30 points, and that's a great DFS GPP guy. Oubre and Anunoby, Kelly Oubre at 4,300, he's giving you 24 or 25 a night, which isn't bad value. So I wouldn't even feel too bad about putting him in as a cash guy without very high upside, but giving him my 24, 25 and then building those other guys around him. At power forward, you've got a couple of guys who I think are a little bit shaky. Markieff Morris and Serge Ibaka, 54 for Markieff and 61 for Serge. I don't feel really good about either of those guys at that price. I like that Markieff has come down to 5,400. That does open up a few more possibilities for him, but I'm not sure either of them is the good option here. While Mike Scott was really limited in Game 4, only had 10 points in 15 minutes after playing well through the first three. I think at 3,700, I'm fine to get back on the horse with him. And again, lock yourself in with a cheap option there. Pascal Siakam's the other power forward. I don't really see much there to love with him. Marcin Gortat, the much maligned Marcin Gortat at 4,100. I think it's a strong center option for a cheap play. At 4,100, given the big minutes in the last two games that the Wizards have won. Now, there is a chance that he can get played off the court. We've seen that many times, or they go to more Mike Scott. But I do think that Gortat is in a decent spot at 4,100. Valanciunas at 58 is too high, and I don't want anything to do with Mahinmi, or probably even Jakob Poeltl at 3,600. I just think his floor's too shaky, and his ceiling is probably not high enough. On DraftKings, Lowry at 7,800, in for that. Really like it. DeRozan at 83, also. Otto Porter at 54 is a bang-in, really strong cash one. Beal at 76, I think is good as well, and John Wall at 10.5. So a bunch of good cash plays on DraftKings. Markieff Morris is down to 4,900, and I might even consider that a cash play. I probably would lean more tournament, but that is pretty bloody cheap for him. Same with Serge Ibaka at 5,700. So both those guys have an extra layer of appeal on DraftKings, as opposed to how they sit on FanDuel. Gortat at 4,400, well, it's not the same spot as him on FanDuel, so I'm not as interested in using him there. The value does change quite a bit when we look at the two sites. On Yahoo, Gortat's minimum salary, absolutely no worries. Fine with that. Mike Scott at minimum, also another cash option. Then you've got CJ Miles as a minimum tournament option who really could have a big opportunity. I think DeLon Wright at $14 could comfortably exceed that, and I'd probably even consider him for cash, while Markieff and DeMar DeRozan are two of the higher guys that I'm interested in. For a guy like John Wall at $45, I'm not 100% locked in on him, although he has played really well, clearly with a 58 average over the last three. You could consider that. I'm not totally on board, but it's not a horrendous one. While Kyle Lowry, I'm not really loving the way that he looks over on Yahoo. Let's go to the next game now. who is this next one? We're going Western Conference. We've got the Minnesota Timberwolves heading back to Houston, trying to stave off elimination. The Rockets were absolutely electric in Game 4, dropping 50 points in the third quarter. Rotational stuff pretty similar. We've got PJ Tucker that dealt with a knee issue, left the court, came back and played. He says he's fine for Game 5. We have to take him at his word there. We're getting some more Nene than I expected. For another 14 minutes for him, Gerald Green with 16 minutes and Ryan Anderson with 17. That's basically the bulk of the rotation outside of the top 6 guys. For the Timberwolves, Jeff Teague suffered a finger injury. He left the game, came back in and only ended up with 28 minutes in what was a piss-poor performance, while Derrick Rose played 32 minutes and played well again. 17, 6 and 4 for Rose on 64% shooting. Another really strong game from him. We also saw extended minutes from Nemanja Bjelica and Gorgui Dieng, while Taj Gibson continues to be limited in these playoffs, and that's something that's continued basically through the whole series, and I don't expect much to change there as we head into Game 5. Game 5. The Rockets are favoured by 12, the largest margin on the slate, and the total is 216.5, also the largest on the slate. Tyus Jones missed Game 4. That enabled Rose to get some of those extra minutes. He's dealing with a knee issue, and he's currently listed as questionable as well. For the point guards, Chris Paul's at 8,900. He had 55 in Game 4. I'm still not 100% locked in on Paul for cash at that sort of a salary. If he came in at 8,000, I might look at it and go, you know what, I feel pretty good about Paul getting to 40. But do I feel good about him getting to 45? I feel less good about it. Jeff Teague at 6,500.
My name is Jeff.
I'm not sure about Jeffy there. Look, he has struggled. The finger bothered him. The numbers have been off. The minutes have been up and down. Yeah, probably leave that alone. Well, Derrick Rose at 4,000. At this point, it's getting hard to deny using Derrick Rose. Now, he did have a shit game too, but 1, 3, and 4 have been pretty strong. He's averaging 21 over the last 3, but as is always the case with Derrick Rose, he's a guy that scores. He's not a good fantasy producer because he doesn't do much in many of the other areas, but he was locked in, especially in that first half in Game 4, and I would consider him a tournament guy. I wouldn't lock him in cash. Jim Harden, 11,800. Bang, let's go with Jimmy. You're getting 55 out of him almost every night, so I'm good with him. Eric Gordon at 54 finally had a decent game, but that salary is too high and there's just no appeal there. While Wiggo is down to 5,800. And even though he was shithouse in Game 4, at 5,800, I do think that you can look at Andrew Wiggins and have a decent level of confidence that he at least gets to that. Jamal Crawford at 4,000, and I'd put him in that Derrick Rose GPP type of a scenario. Both of these guys are going to get their opportunities and get their minutes, and Lord knows Tom Thibodeau is not going to tell either of them not to shoot. So they've got opportunities, but of course I don't think it's a cash spot. Small forward, you've got Jim Butler, you've got Trevor Ariza. Ariza started out hot and then faded. I've got no interest in him at all. While Jim Butler's at 8,400. I think that's probably just a little bit too high for Butler. He just hasn't been the same guy. Continually seems bothered by ankle and wrist and knee and all these sort of injuries. Not really feeling Jimmy here. PJ Tucker doesn't do it for me. Gerald Green and Bjelica. I think Green at 3,700. If the game gets out of hand, we know he can come in and bang in 5 or 6 quick triples. I think that he is worth a tournament look. For the power forwards, there's very little to get interested in. By very little, I mean nothing. Ryan Anderson, Taj Gibson, Gorgui Dieng, none of those guys. At centre, Clint Capella's at 8,200. A big Game 4 for him where he registered 50 points, but I don't believe that he is a lock to get that value in cash games, so he's not a strong play. While Towns is at 9,500. I think both of these guys are more suited to tournaments. I don't think that they're absolute guarantees to bring back that sort of value. On DraftKings, Towns at 8,500. That's something I can get into. I'd be more than happy to use that in cash. I think that Capella at 73 is also a cash option on DraftKings. Harden and Jim Butler at 79. Both of those guys look really appealing. Eric Gordon's down at 4,800. There is some tournament upside there with him on this one. Teague and Chris Paul, along with Wiggins, more tournamenty. Now, Wiggins is way more of a GPP guy on DraftKings as opposed to FanDuel because he is $400 more. Now, he can easily drop a 40 or a 50. But at 6,200, I don't think that's in line with where his floor likely sits. On Yahoo, Jamal Crawford at $11. I feel pretty good about that one, coming in and cashing most days. Chrissy Paul's at 32. That's a good spot for him. And Butler and Harden are both decent enough at those high price spots where I think they can be considered cash guys. Capella is more of a tournament player, as is Eric Gordon at $17. Let's go now on to the last game of the day. It's the Jazz and the Thunder. The Utah Jazz are up 3-1 after an absolutely electric Game 4 performance. Lots of argy-bargy. Russell Westbrook was acting absolutely insane. Jay Crowder got ejected, but he won't be suspended. Westbrook was out of control, picked up tons of fouls early, ended up with 5 of them, and still played 36 minutes. It was him, it was Paul George, but this team just didn't move the ball. They got 10 assists in total as a team. Melo was trash. He's finished. He's just not good. I remember at the start of last year, I said that Kristaps Porzingis was the best player. Best player on the Knicks, and people told me I was crazy. And now look how far that perception. I know some people still think Melo is good. I don't know why, because he's not. He's a horrendous defender. He doesn't move the ball. He can't actually shoot and score anymore. He's just not good anymore. But they keep going with him for big minutes when they should be giving those minutes to someone like Jeremy Grant, and that is really, really impacting them, as well as the way the Thunder is playing defense. It's been a concern. In terms of rotational stuff, we saw Josh Huestis play a little bit late, and I think we might see a little bit more of him in this game. The way he defended was impressive, and that could cut into some of Alex Abrines' playing time and potentially even into Jeremy Grant. So that's something to watch for there. On the Jazz side of things, it was just more of the same. The same steady rotation. Joe Ingles was fantastic. Rudy Gobert. Joe Ingles, not even fantastic, just absolutely shit-talking Paul George into oblivion. Gets in people's faces, knock down threes. If you didn't love what Joe Ingles was doing, then you must be a Thunder fan, because he was fantastic. The Don was excellent. Just another brilliant performance from Donovan Mitchell. Him and Simmons in these playoffs, they are just absolutely dominating. It is amazing to watch. I tweeted this out yesterday. I think that people will look at next year's draft class, and when they perform, and they'll think, oh, this is a shit draft class. They'll just be disappointed, because we won't have two people like Mitchell and Simmons putting up the sort of performances that they do, let alone guys like Tatum. But the level of performances from Mitchell and Simmons is out of control, and I just don't, for as good as I think Doncic is and Jaren Jackson can be, I just don't think they're going to be able to put up the level of performances we've seen from Ben Simmons and Donovan Mitchell, and don't confuse that for a disappointing group of rookies. This group we've got now is just legendarily good, and that's how that comparison is going to come in. If we have a look at how this all plays out for DFS for Game 5, back in Oklahoma City, the Thunder are favoured by 3.5, the closest margin of all the games, and the total's 207.5 points. Russell Westbrook did avoid a suspension. I thought he was a massive chance of getting suspended for walking out onto the floor during a fracas, but no, he escaped with a fine and a technical. He's at 10,600. Yes, he has been disappointing in these playoffs, but I do think that you can't avoid using him in cash. It is a great option. As for the ravishing Rick Rubio, 7,400 for him. Maybe not. I don't have full faith in the shooting ability of Rubio, clearly, and that's a pretty high price, but it's far from one you need to disregard completely. I think there is a great amount of tournament value in there. Fatface Ray Felton and Dante Exum aren't really coming into the picture. The Donovan Mitchell, 8,600. Yep, unless they put him at 10,000, I just don't think you should really be going past Donovan Mitchell. He's putting up good numbers. I'd rather him over Oladipo at this point, just with how consistent he is in his offensive output. For the small forwards, Jingle and Joe's at 6,600, another great game, but I'm not thinking that's a good cash play. I think there is some tournament value there, but considering how well he played, he still only had 35 points in that game, so how much better can he be? And at 6,600, that's sort of the level he needs to get to, so I'm not totally into that. I'm into Paul George at 8,100. I think that's rock solid for cash. George didn't play well in Game 4 and still dropped in 42 points. Corey Brewer's at 43, Royce O'Neal's at 37, and Joshy Huestis at minimum salary. I don't really see either of those guys. Maybe you'd throw Brewer in on the hope that he comes up with 6 steals or something like that. Love Derek Favors here as a strong cash guy, $6,000. Not sure the upside's really there, but the amount of minutes that he's playing, the production is fine, while Melo's at 5,600. And for as shit as he is still getting to that DFS level that he needs to get to, so I don't think it's a bad play for cash. He's not good, but the Thunder aren't going away from him. He's getting those opportunities, and he's just tripping over himself into 27 or 28 points, which is totally fine at 5,600. Jay Crowder's at 45, tournament maybe, nothing too exciting. Urepko and Patterson, let's leave them out of it. At centre, Steve-O Adams is at 6,300, has been nullified by fouls and by Gobert. The price is okay. It's still more of a tournament look, while Gobert at 8,000, again, that's more GPPs. I'd probably rather take Adams than Gobert in a GPP. Don't really like either of them specifically, though, on FanDuel. For DraftKings, it's a different story with those two centres. Adams at 53 and Gobert at 7,000. I think they're both actually cashable players at those salaries. Ingles is still probably a little bit high, but it's okay at 61. Love Westbrook, love George, love the Don. Mello, not as appealing. He's $200 more expensive, so he comes in at 5,800. And Ravishing Rick is also more expensive at 75. So I think those guys probably don't have as much appeal on DraftKings as what they do over on FanDuel. If we look now to Yahoo, not a game where there's a ton of value standing out on Yahoo. I like Derek Favors a bit at $21 as a tournament guy. You could consider Ingles in that spot as well. But everyone else just seems too high. I think Rubio's too high. The Don at 34 might be a bit high. Paul George at 34 is pushing it as well. But I could use either of those guys. I just don't think it's a particularly strong lineup over on Yahoo for this last game of the day. We could definitely be having a few series end on Wednesday. We're possibly going to have a few series end on which day? On Tuesday, as we're recording this show. We'll see how that all goes, of course, and you'll hear about it when you're watching the show and watching the game. Sorry, and we'll talk about that when those games get finished. Don't forget, if you are listening to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, go and leave a 5-star rating and a review, and you can find us on Google Play, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify, and on YouTube. Leave a comment, leave a subscription, and leave a thumbs up. Follow me on Twitter at redrock_bball and check out lockedonsports.com for the rest of the Locked On Podcast Network pods. We are done here, guys. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya. Tobias Harris.